Hi, you're listening to an older episode. The podcast is now called Travel Writing World. You can find the episode show notes and much more at travelwritingworld.com. This is Jeremy Bassetti, and you're listening to All Over the Place, a podcast on travel, culture, and the creative life. Today's episode brings us to Massachusetts, where Paul Theroux speaks with us about Mexico, death, road trips, Donald Trump, and of course, his new book, On the Plain of Snakes. Paul is the author of many best-selling books, including The Great Railway Bazaar and The Mosquito Coast, which was made into a Hollywood film starring Harrison Ford. His new book, On the Plain of Snakes, A Mexican Journey, will be published on October 8, 2019. So now, here is Paul Theroux. I am speaking with Paul Theroux about his new book, On the Plain of Snakes, A Mexican Journey, which is a wonderful, meaty book about Paul's journey along the border and deep into the heart of Mexico. I'd like to thank you so much for your time and coming on the show to speak with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I guess we can just start with the question, what compelled you to visit and write about Mexico?
What impelled me to write it was I think two things. First was my experience of seeing the border for the first time in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Mexico, and realizing that I could park my car in Nogales, Arizona, walk down the street, go through a door, then it was a turnstile and a little door in a big plate, sort of steel plate fence that I couldn't see through, open the door and walk into Mexico, just like Alice in Wonderland. You just through the rabbit hole. And the idea that I was leaving this kind of salubrious, small American town and going into an amazing cultural transformation where there's music, street food, curio shops, bars, and so forth, and it was and dentists and things like that. Mm-hmm. But just by walking through this fence, I was in a foreign country from the United States. I've never had that experience before. So that was the first thing, which is the notion that Mexico is so accessible. I mean, it is right down the street. And the other was the president calling Mexicans rapists, murderers, and saying we don't want them. And so I thought, well, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to acquaint myself with the whole border and with Mexicans in general. And writing at its best destroys the stereotype. Mm-hmm. You read a book or you travel to a place, you think, whether it's Chinese or the Republic of Ireland or Germany or Brazil, whatever, you realize that, people are people and they come in all shapes and sizes, and suddenly there isn't a stereotype. It's they're humanized through writing or travel.
Mm-hmm. It's more nuanced.
So I thought, I also thought I'll drive my own car. I'll drive along the border. I'll cross the border, and then I'll go as far south as I can go, but driving my own car. And people are saying, "Oh, don't do it. It's dangerous. Mm-hmm. Don't do it." So when people say "don't do it," I think it's got to be a good experience. People are saying "don't do it." It's going to work. It's going to work. Well, first, not many people do it. They don't drive across. There's quite a lot of paperwork involved. So that was the motivation. The motivation was seeing this first border town, though I had seen them before, but never in this way. I never walked across. So there was that, the shock of that, and then the sympathy that I felt for people, because on that trip I saw people being deported and Well, going in both directions, actually. There's some people who were heading to cross the border illegally. And I thought, I'm going to take this opportunity. And then I thought, I don't have a job. I don't have anything else to do. I'll make it into a little project. I'll buy a car, a kind of disposable car, if someone steals it or if I wrap it around a tree, and off I go. So that was the way. And I can tell you that in all my traveling life, this was really one of the most wonderful experiences, one of the most stimulating of all the trips I've taken.
Yeah, you hear prohibitions about don't go, and it kind of reminds me of parents' prohibitions against doing drugs and having sex and smoking cigarettes, right? It intrigues you.
All the fun things. I know. I know. That's right. Because smoking is fun. I mean, and everyone knows that it's hard to give up. And I guess you become addicted to it. But God, when people say, "Oh, you shouldn't smoke," I always say, "Do you ever smoke?" And they say no. And I said, "Well, you don't know what you're missing because it's such fun to smoke." But anyway, yeah, so Mexico was like that. Don't go, don't go, don't go. It's dangerous. They're all the same, all that kind of stuff. But then you realize it's a very, very big, complex, multi-layered, multicultural place with great literature, great music, great food. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to do it justice.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, of course, the stereotypes were dispelled on your journey. Could you talk a little bit about specifically, like how did the dissolution of those stereotypes surprise you while you were in Mexico, or what surprised you in Mexico when compared to the stereotype of Mexico being flaunted on the other side of the border?
That's a good question. I think what I found profoundly so was how respectful Mexicans are toward older people. Now, I'm an older writer. I'm an older man. I'm way past retirement age. And in the States, people think, get out of the way. You're in the way. You're just an old guy. You're not going to buy anything. We're going to sell stuff to younger people. And an older person's kind of invisible. Invisible to women, invisible to the young, invisible, even an older writer. They mainly, publishers, readers are mainly interested, what are the young people buying? What are the young people doing? So the idea that Mexico is a place that respects elders, there are special terms for them. So I'm in la tercera edad, the third age. I'm a hombre de juicio. I'm a man of judgment. I'm Don Pablo. So that was profoundly affecting to me, the notion that I can go, that you're feeling sort of, I mentioned this in the book, how you feel sort of disregarded, and then you go to a place and you think, I have some status, just not because I'm a writer, not because I'm an old white guy, but because I'm an older person and someone to listen to. So that's great. And then the other thing, I suppose the big surprise, I hadn't known that. You just know it by living there, by dealing with people. There were other things. One is I made friends there, but I made really good friends. And that struck me, the fact that if you earn the respect of a Mexican person, doing something, you don't just get it by being polite or being nice or giving them money, but doing something that means something. I taught for a while. And I thought, I'm going to teach, but I'm not going to charge anything. Don't pay me, and you don't have to pay any tuition, but just be in my seminar because you're a good writer. So they were Mexican writers, and I made a lot of friends that way. So respect for the old, friendship, and then the other big surprise, I suppose, is the variety of Mexican literature. Books of all kinds, novels, short stories, plays, histories. Just Mexican literature is not translated into English, but it's there. And the number of writers that I met in Mexico City, that's really something impressive. the arts in general, music, painting, writing, all those things. And then the convention of the things that people mention, which is great weather, great food, beautiful landscapes. So all of that, I mean, I know I sound like the Mexican tourist board, but I've traveled quite a lot in my life. I've written 11 travel books. And so I'm a fairly good judge of, is it worth going to this place? Is it worth staying longer? Does it give you something back? And I felt that about Mexico. And I wasn't in tourist Mexico. I wasn't in Cancun. I wasn't in Merida. I didn't go to Veracruz. I did go to Mazatlan and Puerto Vallarta. I didn't go to Acapulco. But I didn't write much about tourist Mexico. I wrote about the Mexico that people live in and the Mexico that people emigrate from, the poor villages and the poor towns in the South.
You speak. You just spoke about one of the surprises is the respect for people in their third age, in the third state. In your book, you talk about there's a theme that you bring up a few times, and that's a theme of feeling old. You said something like part of the reason why you went to Mexico is because you felt old and that you felt that the driving days were numbered. I mean, your descriptions and writing, I guess, are wonderfully alive. So it's hard for me to understand what you mean exactly. But given that the theme of being older runs throughout the book, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you think about life and death now, after having been through Mexico.
That's a complicated question, but thoughts about life and death. But what you tend to think of, I was raised to respect older people and to think that if someone had lived a long time, they had experience. I always think that as a traveler, people say, "I've been to Bhutan, I've been to Johannesburg, I've been to Brazil," and I often think, I've been to a place where you've never been and you can't go. It's called the past. I've been to the past. I lived in the past. I lived in the late 1940s and 50s in America, when America was a very, very different place. So when you live a long time, you have this arc where you've seen things happening, and you've heard people saying, "This is going to happen. This is definitely going to happen. That's not going to happen." And if you've lived through that, you see the promises that people make remain unfulfilled, so that you can say, "By the way, I've heard that before. I know that already. It's not going to happen. It will never happen." So a younger person is more hopeful, at the same time more gullible and more naive about the possibilities. So the possibilities in life, as far as death, I mean, you mentioned death. It's obviously it's inevitable, but I don't. I suppose Mexicans deal with it in the right way, which is they mock death. They think that's just something. There's skeletons everywhere in Mexico, so they're always kind of thinking about it and mocking it, jeering it, satirizing it, dressing up skeletons and parading with skeletons, putting on skeleton makeup. It's not a forbidden topic. It's actually it's part of the culture that death in life in death, and they have this sense that a lot of folk societies have, which is that people don't really die; they just sort of disappear from the earth, but they're still there. They're there as spectral beings, and they pop up every so often, and they need to be propitiated. So that's quite a nice thought, that you don't die, you just sort of go into another realm. And all these things, here I am in my car, just driving around learning these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I could, at any moment, I could get back in the car, drive to the border, and be in Houston or McAllen, Texas, or Arizona. So the idea that this separate culture exists so near to our weird money culture, because Mexicans really don't have a lot of money. They're not. They tend to be very frugal. When they come to the States, they come to the States to look for work. They don't come looking for welfare. They come to do drywall, fix the roof, cut the grass, do stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that these cultural experiences are so accessible to any American is quite a remarkable thing, because I'm used to, say you want to write a book about Africa, and I live near Boston. I would have to fly from Boston to London or Frankfurt, and then Frankfurt to somewhere, and then to Nairobi, and then or wherever, and then start the trip. But this is a trip that I could start just by getting in my car, and I'm there. I just drive through the South, and I'm there. So that was very appealing. And I should say, apropos of your question, which is that what do you think about life and death, is that when I was on the road there and in Mexico, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel, people were respectful, and I knew they were being respectful because I'm obviously older, but driving on the open road on a beautiful day, beautiful sunny day, driving through Mexico, driving from one great place to another, meeting people, you feel alive, you feel young, you feel, full of hope. That you're writing a book and you think, God, there's all this to write about. And I think just a road trip is a very invigorating, even rejuvenating in the true sense of the word, that it makes you feel young. So there's that. It was a road trip after all. Mm-hmm. And I took it as a road trip because my previous book, called Deep South, the subtitle is 4 Seasons on Back Roads, was a road trip. And I thought, I had never done that before. I had always taken a train or a bus or, kayak or whatever. The idea of getting in my car and driving around the South, I found very stimulating. And I liked the trip. I made friends. I wrote the book. Book came out 3 or 4 years ago. And I thought I want to do it again. But I would like to do it in a different country, different context.
I was going to ask you about that, because you've written quite a number of books that deal with train travel, right? The Great Railway Bazaar, the Old Patagonia Express, and Iron Rooster, and so on. And the last few books you've essentially written on cars. So I was going to ask you about the differences between the modes of transport and how that kind of opens you up to perhaps new experiences or new vistas that you would otherwise have. Like, do you have any kind of observations about the differences and the merits and the pitfalls of each?
Yeah, I think that every country can be traveled in and discovered in a peculiar way, in its own peculiar way. Mm-hmm. So that there are some countries, China, for example, is best seen by train. The place is full of trains. They go everywhere. You can sleep on them. You can eat on them. You can meet people on them. The airports are jammed with people. When you get on a plane, you don't really talk to anyone. But so I found that writing the Iron Rooster book, that taking trains all around China was the ideal way of seeing China. Yeah. I'm sure that the roads are better. At the time I was traveling, the roads were terrible and there weren't many cars around. But it may be possible to have a road trip in China now. People have done it. Peter Hessler did it. He's a wonderful travel writer. And Peter Hessler drove around and picked up hitchhikers and wrote an interesting book about it. But I thought that he didn't go to all the places that I went. I drove to Tibet. Mm. I took a train to a place called Golmud, rented a car, and then drove to Tibet. I took a train to Urumqi, in Turfan, which is, thousands of miles from Beijing, and you couldn't drive there through the Taklamakan desert. You'd die. You'd probably never find a gas station, for one thing. And so I solved that problem taking the train. Same South America. At the time I took the Old Patagonia Express trip, there were a lot of trains. I took a train through Mexico. I went to Laredo, Texas, and I took a train to Mexico City. I went to Veracruz. I took a train to Guatemala. Those trains don't exist anymore. You can't find a train. There's one train, they call it the Beast. It's the one that comes from Guatemala, from Tapachula, and migrants take it. But it's a horrible train. It's horrible, and people have written about it. They write about it, as torture. So it's just an old clanking train that takes days. There's no food.
Mm-hmm.
People die on it. Women get raped. Just awful. But it depends where you go. I mean, when I was traveling in the Pacific, I decided to take a kayak with me. So I had a folding kayak, a German folding kayak called a Klepper kayak. And I thought, this is ideal. I'll go to Tonga. I'll go to the Cook Islands. I'll go to New Guinea. I'll go to a place. I'll set up my kayak and I go paddling away. I'll go, and with my tent and my food and everything, I'll go camping. So that's what I did. I did it on 50-odd islands around the Pacific, and I wrote a book called The Happy Isles of Oceania. Didn't take a train.
Mm-hmm.
And not many buses. So I would fly to an archipelago and Samoa, Tonga, wherever, the Marquesas, and paddle a kayak. So I guess my point is that depends where you go. You have to choose the best way of discovering that country. It might be walking. It might be a bus. It might be a train. It might be a boat. It might be a yacht. I don't know, whatever it is. But you discover that way. How can you see the place best? How can you meet
mm-hmm.
people? How can you understand their lives?
And
get to their food.
I suppose in the Deep South, because of the kind of poor infrastructure and the lack of trains, by necessity, perhaps you'd need to go by car. I mean, many of the Greyhound buses don't even, stop in some of the cities down there. So perhaps also...
No, you couldn't do it by bus. Really, you can only do it by car because
mm-hmm.
there's so many back roads. The roads are good, though, but the buses don't go there. There's a couple of trains that crisscross the South, but, that's not going to show you anything.
Mm-hmm.
I felt very strongly that a road trip in the South was the way to do it, and I loved the trip. I also, before I left, I did something that I don't usually do, is I got a list of people in various professions, farmers, in housing and welfare, in just various phases of life that I wanted to meet. And so I met, one person would introduce you to another person. So I didn't meet people randomly at first. I connected with them. People mm-hmm. in housing, building houses, people in welfare, helping people who are below the poverty line and building, fixing up houses for the poor, farming, in Mississippi and Arkansas, they're growing soybeans, rice, wheat and whatnot. And I felt once I had met and proved myself to one group in the South, they readily introduced me to other people. So I could get in the car and they'd say, "Oh, you should meet so and so. He's got a farm over in, Mariana or Helena." And I would get in the car and I'd drive. They would call a person and say, "Paul's coming over. Can you tell him about, show him your fields or whatever, or the houses that you're building?" And that helped me in Arkansas, in Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina. Not too much in Georgia. I had good contacts in Georgia, but I found Georgia was doing okay. South Carolina, not so great. But traveling by car and meeting people, connecting with people, So I suppose you'd say networking, but it wasn't really networking. It was people trying to help, in the South. And I realized then that what interested me most was people who are overlooked. Planes fly over them. The government doesn't care much about them. They don't figure. They live in places where there's no bank, there's no store, the schools are bad, and no one's paying much attention to them. And I thought, well, I want to write about these people in the Delta, in the Ozarks, in parts of Alabama that are notoriously poor, and South Carolina. So I did that, and one of the features of meeting poor people below the poverty line, people who haven't had any breaks, is they keep their culture intact. They tend to, if they're going to church, they keep going to church. If in Mexico, the poor retain their culture because, it hasn't been replaced. They haven't been corrupted by another culture. That's what they've got. So traditional life is lived by people who don't have anything else. They don't have money. They don't travel. They tend to stay in the same place. And so their cultural traditions tend to be intact. I mean, that was a kind of discovery that I made. Well, I've made it earlier in my life, but it was true in the South as it is in Africa or Mexico.
That reminds me of the famous Voltaire quote where he's speaking about money. He says, and it's probably a little bit different than this, but he says, when it comes to money, we are all of the same religion. With the idea being that money has the tendency to kind of level people on not just the same financial, but the same cultural kind of playing field there.
Or the same, ambition. Yeah, that's true. I think that's true. You kind of understand each other. But then you meet people with no money, they've never had money, that will never get money, then you have to figure out what their true interests are. I mean, maybe they want it, but I found, work takes the place of that. I mean, they tend to be underpaid. I mean, that was a discovery. NAFTA underpays that just is kind of a way of getting cheap labor. And, no one in Mexico is really happy about that. But this kind of discovery in travel makes you travel more. It actually stimulates the desire to see something else. When there's no discovery in travel, you think, well, I'm not learning anything. I'll just go home. But when you're learning something and making a discovery in travel, it gives you heart and it helps you move on and lifts your morale, because it can be very demoralizing to travel, and people don't figure that. I mean, I suppose some people do, but it can be, it can be very lonely. Someone once called travel is the saddest pleasure, the saddest pleasure, and in a way it is. It's the saddest pleasure. But then you meet someone, or you discover something. Whatever it is, a painting, a food, or some cultural insight, and then you think, well, I want to see more, and it gets less sad. There's kind of joy that comes from that.
You're talking about people that were overlooked were among the most interesting, and what I found very, very interesting and just kind of compelling is the portraits or the snapshots in this new book of the migrants. That there's a section in the book where you recount the stories of some of the migrants, and I mean that part was just fascinating. It's not just the story of an American traveler going through Mexico, but the stories of other types of travelers. Perhaps going to the United States, in which, those episodes are interesting. And it also kind of begs the question, a larger question, how is it that you're able to connect and have conversations with these people without kind of raising the alarm or raising suspicions? Like how did you go about that?
To meet people in that situation, which is a situation of crisis, you need to be respectful and oblique. You can't confront. You don't just show up and ask them a million questions. You need to kind of show that you have some concern, that you can help in some way, explain something, that you're genuinely interested in where they come from. What I found a lot of times was that I would be talking and asking questions, and they would talk about their experiences, how they were trying to get to see a husband or a child in the States and get lost in the desert and get thrown out. And, talking to them, they would start to cry. And it's very melancholy for some. Others, would work for years and years picking strawberries in Fresno and came back to Mexico for a funeral, and then they couldn't go back to Fresno where they'd left their family. So sad stories of separation. But how you meet the people is I needed to be introduced to these people by intermediaries in some place. I didn't just bump into them in the street. I met them at migrant shelters, through third parties, priests, or migrant groups that were trying to help them. And I tried to be, in some of the time I wasn't taking notes. I took notes after, so I wasn't sitting there writing stuff down and saying, so where do you come from and how do you spell it? I had conversations with them. And I think that's another way. I've always felt that someone taking notes is sort of suspect. I realize that in many respects you have to take notes of conversations, but I've trained myself to remember conversations that I have with people so that I can look them in the eye, talk to them, and then immediately afterwards, when we kind of split up, say, nice talking to you, I immediately go and I write everything down. And so in many cases, that's what I did, which was not to have a notebook. Sometimes I did have a notebook, but I tried not to look too much like, the cub reporter saying, so what was it like? What were the cops like? What did they say to you? And how do you spell it? And that sort of thing, which to a lot of people can be very off-putting.
This reminds me of the episode in the book, and we won't spoil it, but the episode in the book where you ask a driver to take you into the tolerance zones. And the driver was very suspicious about you having a notepad and a pen handy, as that might raise some alarms there. It's, very interesting.
I know. Yeah. Well, there's a level of anxiety that was on the border. And there's a level of anxiety on the border. On the one hand, inspired by the police, who are pretty ferocious, and then on the other hand, by the cartels, which are even more ferocious. So, people have their guard up. They're not paranoid exactly, but they're very, very careful about how they look, where they go, what they say, and they don't even use the word cartel. No one would say, "Oh, it was the Zeta cartel, los Zetas carteles." They would say, they just whisper mafia. They don't. They're saying the word. Just saying it just marks you as someone to be. You got to be really careful. So, I felt that to be the case. That you had to understand the anxiety of people who live there, the sort of threats that they live with, because although I'm very upbeat about Mexico, I know that they have a huge murder rate. The cartels control the border. They control immigration. Chinese people come to Mexico, pay $50,000 to a cartel, and they go through a tunnel to San Isidro. So it's not as though everyone's in a caravan, climbing the fence. Some people are being escorted into the States, and you need to understand that not all migrants are the same. So anyway, those are all the discoveries that I felt I was making, and useful stuff that I thought, well, I'm here, I'm on this trip, I have something to write about. That's always a very helpful experience, to think I've got something. It's not just the same thing every day. I don't have to invent anything or create something. I'm actually I'm making discoveries. The other thing, as I said, I made friends, and if you're traveling among friends, it's very reassuring to be with people who have your back and who are being helpful. And I probably had more help writing this book just from Mexicans who realized I'm a serious person. I'm on their side. I'm kind of like them in some ways, which is that, I'm vulnerable. I'm in my car. I'm driving in, back roads and so forth. They're sympathetic to that. They see, I'm not being picked up by an Uber driver and taken to the airport so that I can fly back to wherever. I'm kind of facing a lot of the issues that they're facing. That's helpful. And they can identify with that. And as a result, I got a lot of help.
Yeah, it's when I went to Mexico, that was one of the observations that I walked away with, is that, Mexicans aren't rapists and murderers, but they're actually very helpful and very friendly and willing to have real conversations with people that are foreigners. I remember taking a bus from, maybe it was Guadalajara to Zacatecas or someplace, and sitting next to this gentleman on the bus, and he was the most friendly. I was a bit on guard, right? I was a young man at that time, but he was the most friendly and helpful person that I've probably ever met. He even bought me an ice.
Yeah, that can happen.
Yeah. And so it's alarming in one sense, the stereotypes that are I guess communicated on one side of the border, which completely are shattered when you take the time and just visit Mexico, right? It's dangerous, but not as dangerous as it's made out to be. And people are, as you say, very friendly and respectful and helpful.
I felt that to be the case, and I felt, but you need a certain amount of luck too. That you can be unlucky, and there are plenty of unlucky people there too. So it's not all roses, but I must say I enjoyed it, and I suppose it's something about this time of life, because I was in Mexico in the 70s. In the 70s, I was kind of a smart aleck, just traveling, and I felt, a travel book is about the traveler. It's about me. It's sort of what happened to me, and I'm, here I am on this bus, and now here I am eating a taco or whatever it was. I felt, as you get older, you realize it's not about you. It's really other people's lives are difficult, and other people are 100 times more interesting than you are. That you're just a punk, and so that was a discovery that I made, and it served me well in Mexico. Also, there's a lot of places, there are places I would never want to go back to. But Mexico is a place I've been back since I finished writing the book. I've been back 3 times. So just to see friends, to do things, and I'll keep going back. So it was a great discovery to have. And then people even say, you should retire here, you should live here. Well, that's not going to happen. But, it's nice of people to say.
Yeah. There's something very honest about life there. And I guess, there's, I guess, a couple threads here we can go down. But I think what I find very honest about your book is that it's not just, as you say, kind of the narrative of the traveler, but it does try to give the voice to some of the voice to the Mexicans, and also attribute some of that voice to your own experiences, especially on the sorry, especially on the border, where it's a very honest book in terms of complicating the U.S.-Mexican relations. And what I mean by that is that it seems to be you're very critical of kind of the rhetoric coming out of Trump's mouth, but also very critical about the history of American politics, including Obama era and Clinton era.
Definitely. No one has come up with an answer, and certainly Obama didn't have the answer. Clinton didn't have the answer. NAFTA is not the answer. Obama's deportations, what did they solve? Nothing. I don't believe in open borders. People, there are people running for president who are saying we should decriminalize. We should have open borders. You can't have open borders. You need. We need to have a sensible immigration policy, and so I'm not. I'm kind of a lone voice here because there are a lot of people saying, well, these poor people, they want to walk across the border, and we're stopping them. And my general feeling is, get in line. Take a number, and if you're in a very bad place, tell your story and show that your life is in danger or whatever. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that I mentioned Chinese who pay the cartels. It's not only them: Indians, Pakistanis, Afghans, Syrians, Congolese, Nigerians, Angolans, what they call special interest aliens. You never hear about them. But they're in jails up and down the border, in holding pens, saying, they tried to get across. There are some prisons that have hundreds of Indians in them, Indians from India. And what's the story with that? I mean, India is the world's largest democracy. Are they being persecuted, or they just have the money to get to the States? So obviously, some kind of policy is necessary and some kind of security too. So I discuss this in the book, but it's not a polemical book. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm just a traveler writing down people's stories, trying to meet people, and I can't pass myself off as any kind of sociologist, anthropologist, economist, or anything like that. I'm not an expert. But then the experts don't have many answers either. So I'm just the eyewitness, I suppose you could say. But I have traveled my whole life, since I was probably 21, 22 years old. And I'm now in my 70s. So 50 years I've been going up and down, trying to figure out what's going on. And so much of what governments say or people say is wrong. It's wrong. Wrong in Africa, wrong in South America, wrong in Europe, wrong about the borders, wrong. And so I've tried to make sense of this just by seeing it, that learning by doing, being an eyewitness. Someone once said, the only true knowledge arises out of direct experience. True knowledge arises out of direct experience. Do you know who said that? Chairman Mao. That's one of the thoughts of Chairman Mao. But it happens to be a true. He wasn't the nicest man in the world, but that's a true thought. I mean, that genuine knowledge rises from direct experience. I suppose that a true traveler can say that.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I want to be respectful of your time here. And in closing, there's this wonderful point, to go full circle now, there's this wonderful point in the book where you're in Oaxaca and you just finished celebrating the Day of the Dead celebrations. And you're reflecting on the experiences. And if I may quote you here, you say, "It was at that point, more than halfway through my road trip, and in a lifetime of travel had never felt more fully alive, more eager to wake each morning and see what the day would bring. I kept thinking with pleasure, I'm still here, right? And it's wonderful kind of...
What page is that on?
Gosh, I wrote it down, and...
Oh, okay. All right.
If you give me a second, I could probably...
It definitely... I remember saying that. I couldn't recall where I actually...
I have it here. It's 255.
255, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I got a book here. Check it out.
It's at the top.
So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. That's that's a thing called Memento Mori.
Correct.
Yeah. Remember you must die is Memento Mori. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I guess this relates to one of the kind of virtues of travel, right? You experience the world, but you also you feel alive and invigorated by kind of exploring and seeing the world. And I don't know, it's just, there's something just wonderful and something that rings true about that. And you fall in love with a place and with travel when you can, feel alive there, or have the sensation of rebirth, I guess.
That's true, but I think it's salutary to remember that you can fall in love with a place, but you can't really let your guard down. You can't ever think that you're anonymous, that you're invisible, that you're one of the bunch. When you start thinking that, you're kind of being presumptuous. And I think that it helps to remember that you're conspicuous, that I'm a conspicuous gringo. I remember being in the car. I was in a gas station in the middle of Mexico, and two kids walked by, and one of them just pointed. My window was closed, actually, and he pointed and said, "Gringo, gringo, gringo, gringo," like that. And I thought, here I am in a car, an ordinary car. A lot of Mexicans have cars like that. It was just a Nissan, older car. And then I realized I'm visible today. I'm visibly a gringo. And it was a country area. That wouldn't happen in Mexico City, because a lot of people in Mexico City look like gringos, but they're not. I mean, they're from Europe and Spain, so forth. But they look ambiguous. But so this idea that I love the place, but I also think you need to be respectful. You can't make presumptions. You can't presume on people. You need to understand that you're a guest. You have no rights. If a cop stops you, you need to negotiate. He can really, really ruin your day or your month or your life. So there's that too. I think this whole idea of you have to be patient and you have to be respectful. And I think that a lot of travelers, or a lot of people who travel, aren't respectful enough, or they're not. They tend to think, "I'm here. Here's my money. You need me," and they actually don't. They think you're here today, you'll be gone tomorrow, and I think living in Hawaii has shown me a lot that to a very large degree, which is that there are people who live in Hawaii, natives of Hawaii, citizens of Hawaii, who've lived there for generations, and they see people come and go. They've seen so many people come and go. And the presumption of people who go to Hawaii is that I'm here, this is America, and, I've got as much right as you have. And that's true, they do. But there's a small town element among what they call the kama'aina, the long-timers, the old-timers in Hawaii, who notice that they're being disrespected or presumed upon. So I've lived there for 30 years, and I still don't feel a sense of belonging in Hawaii, although, people do. They come, they stay, and they feel that. But I don't feel that. And I think you need to understand that you have to prove yourself. Mm-hmm. You have to show by example that you have to earn the respect of people. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in life, I suppose when I first started to travel, I was in the Peace Corps. I still have the mind of a Peace Corps volunteer, but the Peace Corps does teach you that you have to earn people's respect, and you have to give something of yourself. You can't just take it. Mm-hmm. So it's helpful, no matter where you're traveling, and it's served me well, I think.
So where to next?
I have an idea for a book of travels that I'm not ready to to divulge, but I have a good idea. I have a good idea, and we'll see how it works out. But so where to? It would be a number of places, but it would be traveling on a theme. I realize I'm not being very helpful, but
no, I understand.
As far as actual travel, I mean, in about 2 weeks, I'm going to Lisbon. I'm giving a talk at a convention or a sort of seminar in Lisbon for a couple of days, and then I'm coming back. And so I do that kind of travel, which is going to a place and doing a job, talking on an assignment or something like that. But that's the travel on my mind at the moment.
Are you going to do a book tour for On the Plain of Snakes?
Yeah, I'm going to various places. I'm going to Nashville, New York City, Seattle. I think I'm going to Austin, Texas.
Okay.
Portland. Yeah, places. Yeah, not many, but some. You know, bookstores are fewer and fewer, and one way to reach people is what we're doing now, which is a podcast where people, I would show up in Philadelphia or, wherever, St. Louis, go to a bookstore and say the things that I'm telling you now. And this is a way of reaching those people whose bookstore has disappeared. Mm-hmm. And so they can hear this and hear me talking and say, sounds like an interesting book, On the Plain of Snakes, a Mexican Journey. I think I'll get that. So that's, this is a good substitute. It's longer, and you're asking interesting questions. So I think it takes the place of going on a book tour to a certain extent.
Well, I'll try to find a link to your physical dates, and I can put it in the show notes of this episode so people, maybe they can go see you in person too. But thank you so much for your time. I had a wonderful time chatting with you and also reading the book. I read a lot of travel books, and this one hit all the buttons for me, so thank you.
Good, I'm glad. Thanks, Jeremy. It's nice talking to you. Bye for now.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of All Over the Place. Don't forget to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app and follow us on social media. Please subscribe to our newsletter to receive emails with travel-related news, book recommendations, and resources from around the world. Links can be found at allovertheplacepodcast.com.